Welcome. Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Contagion, and I'm the head of the School of International Relations. And Tim has asked me to launch this event, and I'm excited to be here. And I was reflecting on this, so this is the first event for the 25th anniversary of CSTPV, and I kind of feel it's hard to believe. And that I arrived in 1999 to do my PhD with Paul, and at the time, Paul Wilkinson, right, one of the founders, and at the time I thought it's already legendary, right? CSTPV was already so well known, and here we are 25 years later, and it's just continued to grow in esteem and in legendary status. And so again, I think this coming year, CSTPV has some excellent events planned. I think really events that we can all learn from and gain knowledge from. And what I'm excited to hear tonight is what Tim has been working on for the past at least year, maybe longer. And so it's his kind of inaugural lecture for the book, soon to be book, by the title of the lecture, which is Killing Strangers, How Violence Became Modern. And maybe someday he'll give me advice on how to make my titles as accessible as I like it to do. But thank you, Tim. I'll hand it over.
Thank you, Karen, for that over-generous introduction. Before warming to my theme, getting into my stride, or perhaps into my lurch, I wish to say a few words about tonight's occasion and the series of events that it will inaugurate, stretching through to the end of 2020. As director, it's a huge honor to open CSTPV's 25th anniversary program of events. It's a program that will look both forward and back. Now, I happen to think that sort of self-congratulation is a much underrated human emotion. So as a banal point, I would just gently point out to you that very few academic research centers in the social sciences last anything like 25 years. Least of all in the ever-shifting and fast-paced world of studying terrorism and political violence. Furthermore, although we don't like to admit it, the social sciences tend to have a fairly dire record of predicting the future accurately. You know, you'll find the library, if you search hard enough, full of books like The Future of East Germany, published in 1988, and things like that. And so I wish, therefore, to take this public chance to pay tribute to the late Paul Wilkinson, whom Karen's already mentioned, and Bruce Hoffman as our founding fathers back in 1994, for the foresight and indeed the farsight they had to reach the conclusion back then that terrorism might just continue to matter. And let's not forget that in 1994, that was far from being hegemonic common sense. It was fashionable back then, with the IRA and the PLO winding down their armed campaigns, with the South African peace process gathering pace. It was rather fashionable to think that terrorism and political violence were yesterday's problems. They were Cold War detritus that could be safely ignored. They were fading phenomena. And it is, I think, a tribute to the acumen of our founding fathers that in an age of short-termism, they took longer views. Also a tribute, I think, to St Andrews University and the School of International Relations in particular, when it came along, that they also took generous and supportive views of that subject area. Now, historians basically all want to be writing decline and fall. We all want to be sort of beautiful stylists. So I don't like acronyms very much. But I think it is fair to say that international relations at St Andrews is very good in what I call VHN, violent human nastiness. In other words, genocide, war, security studies, peace and conflict studies, and so on. And I think CSTPV has been much sustained, much enriched by the academic camaraderie in studying some of the worst of things that human beings can do to each other alongside those research centers. So I wish in my opening to pay tribute both to CSTPV's inheritance, but also to its web of institutional relationships. They help us be more than the sum of our parts. And they have helped us maintain a CSTPV tradition of scholarship that for a relatively small research centre I think has been remarkable for its sheer intellectual range and ambition. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Now, whether my own lecture tonight to you is at all worthy of that grand tradition, I will leave for you to judge. Its choice of focus is quite deliberately pragmatic and prosaic. And it starts really somewhere where we have all been, which is the security queue at an airport. You know, that strange ritual, quasi-religious, by which you come under suspicion, have to remove your shoes and your belt and everything else, or your snotty tissues in your pocket and so on and so forth. You're then scanned and somehow redeemed, blessed, told to go forward, and you're sort of, as I say, there's a kind of rebaptism almost that you then go forward as a sort of renewed and approved character into the rest of the airport, if you can then find your shoes and your snotty tissues and so on. And really my point is a very banal one, but I think an important one. You cannot catch a plane or an underground train in 2019 and not be reminded of the fact that total strangers might slaughter you. That those announcements, whether we try and block them out or not, are insistent and repeated. And we tend, I think, to think this is normal. We've sort of half made our peace with it. My argument tonight to you is that viewed in any longer-term historical perspective, it is not. It is distinctly weird. So friends, we live in strange times. And one of the strangest things about these strange times, it seems to me, is the sheer impersonality of so much of the political violence we see around us. Its breathtaking, random callousness. Its quality of what the poet W.B. Yeats 100 years ago called its abstract hatred, or what Joseph Conrad slightly earlier in The Secret Agent called blood-stained inanity. And I think we should be puzzled by this. We should be puzzled by this phenomenon that strangers might want to kill us, because it has come from somewhere historically and it needs to be explained. And I want perhaps to try and illustrate this with a single anecdote. Located back in the middle of the French Revolution, in the middle of the 1790s, in the Rhone Valley in the south of France, a harassed government official was trying to explain to his superiors in Nîmes that his village had had nothing to do with a series of recent murders. And this is how he did it. He wrote to his superior saying, quote, "You can grasp that we could not be enemies of people we didn't know. We could not be enemies of people we didn't know." In that phrase is contained an entire theory of violence and how it happens. This was still a world where enemies were made, not begotten, made through the frictions of local intimacy and face-to-face relationships primarily, not through the pronouncements of deracinated ideological category. At the risk of stressing the blindingly obvious to an intelligent audience, the world we live in now is very, very different. Back in the summer of 2017, I confess, Karen, I've been working on this for slightly longer than I admitted. Back in the summer of 2017, when I first started thinking about this project in earnest, the internet was awash with details of the most recent jihadist atrocities in Barcelona. 13 had been killed in a van attack. 5 had then been shot dead by counter-terrorist police in a nearby town. And I remember thinking that this was awful, but by the time I finished this book, if I ever finish this book, something else would have come along to overlay it, or perhaps many things would have come along to overlay it. And I was right. Because deep down, we all know such atrocities have a short publicity half-life, usually. That is why they have to be repeated regularly to regain our attention. And deep down, we probably expect that to happen too. Friends, this is a very strange state of affairs. So tonight I ask, with some deliberate naivety, but also I think with some good reason, the very simplest of questions. How on earth did we get here? How on earth did we get here, with the emphasis very much on the how? I'm most interested in how and not why questions. How has violence become, or more specifically political violence, become, has it changed over time? How has it evolved in connection with other forces? If I do deal with why questions, it's very much second order why questions. Why does this type of violence tend to happen and not that type of violence? You'll probably, if you are studying terrorism, be already familiar with the 19th century anarchist phrasing that terrorism or political violence, whatever we want to call it, can be understood as propaganda of the deed. Have you come across that? It's a sort of common phrase that you'll come across. I think most terrorism studies is much more interested in propaganda than it's interested in deeds. I'm interested in the deeds. I'm biased towards the study of actions and not ideas. By that, I don't think that ideology is unimportant, let me clarify. Of course, to explain political violence, we need to understand ideology, but I don't think it is all there is. In a seminal article from 1981 entitled The Causes of Terrorism, with her usual lucidity, Martha Crenshaw argued for a key distinction between what she called preconditions, factors that set the stage for terrorism in the long run, the background, if you like, and what she, on the other hand, called precipitants, specific factors that immediately precede the occurrence of terrorism, or direct causes, if you like. Most of terrorism is about precipitant. Most of terrorism studies is about precipitants, the direct causes. Because I'm obstinate, I'm interested in the preconditions, the background factors. And while I'm about it, while I'm having my therapy in public, I'll declare another heresy. As the director of a major terrorism studies research centre, I'm not going to spend ages trying to define terrorism for you. I am well aware, as I say this, that many of you are probably wrestling with early essays on what is terrorism and what is it not, and you have my full and sincere rhetorical solidarity and sympathy. One of the abuses of power, such as it is that you can bypass these questions. As my colleagues are well aware, I tend to approach, as a historian, the problems of trying to define terrorism with the same good advice my wife gives me. My wife gives me advice when times are hard, when the skies are dark, when things look bleak. She leans over and she whispers 3 little words to me. Those 3 little words are not, as you good people will probably assume, I love you. Those 3 little words are, get over it. I think if we're going to take a really long-term view of terrorism, to some extent we have to get over trying to define it too closely. There's too many and variant contexts at play. We have to treat it as a slightly blurred and moving target. So I'm not going to obsess over what is terrorism, what is political violence, where the boundary lies. I'm just going to approach the study of political violence as really unofficial, unlicensed violence in pursuit of power. Now, far more problematic for me than defining terrorism is trying to define modernity. My good friend and colleague Peter Lair was kind enough a few years ago when we were co-teaching the 5901 introductory module that some of you are doubtless, what is the right word, undergoing, experiencing, enjoying perhaps right now. He allowed me to set the essay question, do not worry, it will not come your way, it's been retired. But he allowed me to set the essay question, what, if anything, is modern about terrorism? I think it's fair to say it was not a high point of my academic career. It was something of a turkey. Almost invariably, students understood modern to be a synonym for recent. So, to nail my colours to the mast, or perhaps to lightly Velcro my colours to the mast, let me try and make clear to you I am understanding modernity and modern in a much broader, in a much deeper sense than this. And at the risk of, boiling down in horribly reductionist fashion, deeply complex and sophisticated literatures from historical sociology and other disciplines, I'm sort of going to run with the classic sociological distinction between the Gemeinschaft, the society of face-to-face relationships, predominantly rural, predominantly agricultural, tradition-bound, and the Gesellschaft, the society of impersonal transactions, predominantly industrial, urban, highly mobile. Here my choice of geographical focus is, I'm afraid, also highly unoriginal, looking at what you might call the original core of the global north, what people used to call, the West, the USA and Western Europe since the late 18th century. Those societies, capitalist, militarily aggressive, whose international hegemony in the early 21st century is so clearly fading. Now, to be very clear here too, because it's an important point, I'm not arguing that this is the only form of modernity, that Western modernity is all that there is. My point is simply that these were societies that earlier than others tended to cross various crucial thresholds, demographic explosions of population, urbanization, and so on and so forth, and it makes sense to study them together. I'm not arguing that modernity is a sort of apotheosis, a better way of being, or a fixed destination, that there's the kind of West got there and the rest of the world is going to catch up. That's not what I'm arguing at all. I see modernity as an open-ended and shifting, but still a distinctive social condition. And the point really is this, that this condition of being modern affects how violence in those societies takes place. Modernity does not conquer or banish violence, as is often assumed. How often do you hear David Cameron talk about ISIS and say, oh, it's medieval, it's barbarism, we're modern, we're not like that. Modernity doesn't conquer violence. It may rechannel it, it may often hide it, the sort of kind of conjuring trick in which the state hides its own violence. But violence is in the foundations of modernity, including Western modernity. But it does fundamentally change it. And political violence can never stand entirely apart from society and social processes. So very simply, really, in the time I've got available to you tonight, I'm going to talk about push factors, those factors, coercive factors in the modern experience in the areas of the global north I'm looking at over the past 250 years that pushed rebel violence, oppositional violence in certain directions, that molded it, that shaped it, sort of effectively kind of made it into a kind of residual niche form of violence. And I'll then turn to the pull factors, those new opportunities in modern conditions that have allowed political violence to take truly innovative and new forms that they hadn't taken before. And lastly, I'll try in the final minutes to draw some of it together, to give some sort of audit of where we're at in the early 21st century in 2019, because I hold the strange view that historians should have something to say about the present and the future as well as the past. Let's begin with push factors. Let's begin with constraints. And here, I think, the key place to start in reviewing, not all, but most, of the violent conflicts across Western states that I'm looking at, or the global north states, has been their lopsided asymmetry. Since the late 19th century at least, a current feature of these societies, Western European and American societies, has tended to be hopeless micro-insurrections that are mounted against largely stable societies. What the German writer Heinrich Böll called, discussing the Red Army faction, as the wars of the 6 against the 60 million. Now, very often we try and explain these movements through their ideas. I imagine you've all encountered David Rappaport and his 4 ways of rebel terrorism. That's one way of doing it, to foreground the ideology. I want to make a more sociological point, which it seems to me striking that it is only the utopians, it is only the dreamers and the deranged who dare take on these states, because the contest is so asymmetrical. And even now, in 2019, I think if we look around us at the far right or Islamist terror, it's very clear that it's being waged by those who believe, against all the evidence of their eyes, that God is on the side of the small battalions, not the big ones. By contrast, the coercive power of the modern state is titanic. It is enormous, unlike anything seen really before in history. Let's not forget the Roman Empire didn't even have a police force. Now, this takes different forms in different places, even within the global north. 100 years ago this year, Max Weber, the sociologist, famously offered his definition of a state as an entity that seeks to monopolize violence. In the USA, by contrast, there's a different tradition, land of the free, in which interpersonal and ghetto violence can be fairly complacently tolerated, arguably, so long as the central organs of government are not directly threatened. If they are, the federal state then massively outbids any challenger. The best illustration I can give of that is the end of the Blues Brothers. You know, that moment at which, all the kind of resources pour in. So it's a different model, but still the point remains the same. Nothing can be allowed to threaten the federal state's dominance. But either way, after about 1865, end of the American Civil War, the bulk of serious political violent disorder in these societies tends to come from external defeat in war. And that's quite remarkable, I think, historically. But this isn't just a matter of superior military resources and directly coercive power. It's also a sort of conjuring trick by which states put their violence out of sight for most of the time, for most people in public view. There are others who have different experience of these states, but the first look, violence has been sort of hidden from view. So these kind of states, as they develop in the areas we're looking at, they reflect an ability to coerce invisibly and to use violence sparingly. And the key really to this overwhelming dominance and force is not, as I say, just the violence, but the organizing capacity behind it, the infrastructural capacity. So my argument really is that we have to examine bureaucracy and coercion together because they belong together. Now, as a thought experiment, and it is only that, it is not a piece of advice, it is not a practical suggestion, I would suggest that you decide to hang on to a St. Andrew's Library book and see what happens. First of all, you will get polite reminders, then the reminders will get less polite, then they will get more threatening, then you may be fined. Eventually someone will challenge you. If you push on past them or whatever and carry on, eventually some security guard will be called, and if you carry on ignoring them and going your own sweet way, and presumably in the end the police get called and they do whatever the police have. Please. Somewhere the capacity or the threat of violence, however well hidden it is. As I say, anyone tweeting, please delete that tweet. I don't mean anything against the lovely library staff. It's just an illustrative point, a heuristic device, not an explosive device. But the more general point, perhaps, is that the rise of the Gesellschaft, the rise of the society of strangers, if you want to call it that, and the states that accompany that do two things that are contradictory. They create anonymous societies of strangers where we interact and rely upon people we do not know all the time. And this in turn creates potential laboratories for a few in innovative violence. You know, if you grew up in some peasant village in 18th century France, the priest or the lord of the manor or whoever knew everything you did. Very little room for going off-piste. You know, modern cities are much more anonymous than that. To some extent, as I say, they can function as laboratories for many kinds of innovation and experimentation, but including violent experimentation. But the other corollary to that is the state can, if it knows where to look, kind of monitor you fairly closely. You know, everywhere in time is inspected, registered, taxed, audited, otherwise monitored. Ted Kaczynski, who may be known to some of you as the Unabomber, the guy who holed up for 18 years in the remotest regions of Montana, waging a one-person letter bomb campaign against scientific modernity, really, industrial society. Killed 3 people, injured 18, I think. Sorry, injured 23. Even this guy in his self-built log cabin in the western Montana wilderness with no running water or electricity, he still gets visited by the census taker every few years. So you know, even there, the state has some idea who you are, even though in this case it didn't know what he was up to for a long time. So the general point is that we tend to live under regimes of hyperregulation that would have amazed our ancestors. And that from the sort of late 18th to the late 20th centuries, the societies of the global north that I'm looking at have sort of squeezed out this potential for mass insurrection. In Europe, at least before 1850, revolutionary situations tended to ignite wars. After 1850, it reverses. It's wars and defeats in war that ignite revolutionary situations. And by the end of the 19th century, it's pretty clear, even to people like Friedrich Engels, the communist revolutionary, that the age of barricades is over. It's not going to work. These kind of societies have effectively become impregnable to mass challenges from below. And what happens is something truly innovative, is that political violence is driven underground, it takes different forms, and in the 1880s you see the emergence of something truly new, the urban bombing campaign, a repetitious sequence of explosions staged from below for wider political effect, effectively a sort of exploding advertising campaign. Now, I think this is a vital period, the late 19th century. I think we can see the ancestors in the Dynamite War of 1883 to 1885 that Irish-American Republicans waged in London and other British cities. You can see the sort of ancestor of the cellular underground movements of the 20th century. In the anti-organizational wing of the anarchist movement, you can see a kind of prefiguration of leaderless resistance, a sort of strategy that's been adopted by the far right and jihadist movements in recent years. The idea that if the state is always going to be better organized and better resourced than you, then the way to outbid it and outthwart it is to be deliberately disorganized, a much sort of looser network or mobilization. Now, I could say more about the evolution of political violence over the 20th century, in particular, I think the crucial and neglected relationship between small violence from below and state terrorism, state violence from above. But I wish now, just for now, to stick with this narrow point about infrastructural power, bureaucratic power, and the way that it forces insurgent movements into clandestine forms. And it's very striking that the memoirs of the New Left of the early 70s in both West Germany and America kind of illustrate what this meant for them in practice. These were movements that dreamt of world revolution. What did they spend their time doing? They spent their time scrubbing the underside of the toilet seat because they had learnt from trial transcripts that that's where the police looked for fingerprints. If you did a house move, it was a week's solid cleaning of every single surface. Terribly arduous, enervating drain on energy and resources. People like Bill Ayers in their memoirs, whinge constantly about how they had to obey speed limits, and they'd never obeyed a speed limit in their life because they got pulled over, then their dodgy haircut and their dodgy ID might be recognized. So, these were sort of utopian movements forced to be kind of conspicuously law-abiding, at least on the surface, because they knew what they were up against. Even a much more sophisticated, much better resourced movement, like the Provisional IRA, was eventually, arguably, contained, ground down in an attritional struggle against the vastly superior forces of the British state. Jerry Bradley's memoirs document this really quite powerfully. He starts off in the early 70s with the IRA as himself as a young volunteer, hundreds of young activists taking potshots at the British Army. By the early 90s, what is the Belfast IRA? It's about stripped down to a core of about 20 operators, all kitted out with boiler suits, nose plugs, ear plugs, anything to try and defeat the forensic investigators. And arguably, of course, since the Provisional IRA was relatively well-resourced, smaller groups tended to go under much quicker in these unequal struggles. Jan Enger's study of European acts of terrorism in 1950 to 1995 found that of 188 armed groups he identified, 80.3% failed to stay active for more than 2 years, and 55.1% of all groups never killed anyone. As he put it, the majority of terrorist groups carry out few actions, kill few people or none at all, and disappear after a short time. So I've tried to make a general argument that it's the enormous infrastructural power of the states that I'm looking at that has tended to squeeze out potential oppositional violence. You can think of this, if you like, as a sort of the Wilson toothpaste theory of modern terrorism. There are important caveats. Bureaucracies are always utopian. They always deal with people in the abstract, and this means they're extraordinarily hard to coordinate. There's always turf wars between bureaucracies, and it's often discussed in the counterterrorism literature like if only people worked harder and showed a bit more goodwill, it could all mesh together. But you read the 9/11 report on relations between the CIA and the FBI, you'll see that actually the problems go deeper than that. They're much more structural. Bureaucracies are large, cumbersome, hard to direct, especially if the structure of the state is particularly complex. I think my favorite is the example of this is the communist combatant cells in Belgium, who were sort of brief entity, well, actually not that brief, I mean, they lasted for over a year, from 1984 to 85. They only had 4 members, and yet they were being chased by, basically 589 communal police forces, 27 judicial police forces across various precincts, and a gendarmerie spread across 5 different regions, reporting variously to bits of the National Defense Ministry or the Judiciary, with linguistic tensions on top. The whole thing was a mess, and that's the reason they could keep going for so long. And you see exactly the same structural weakness occur in more recent jihadist campaigns in Belgium, also arguably in and the Spanish federal forces has also been a problem. And when you scale this up to the international level, bureaucratic coordination is even harder. So, total monopolies of violence are just never possible. And, my esteemed colleagues, Javier Argamanes, Bernhard Blumenau, Kieran McConaughey have all written on the difficulties of actually these kind of bureaucratic counter-terrorist strategies, just how hard they are to get right. My point here is really just a very limited one that sort of a lot of the groups we tend to look at in terrorism studies are the sort of political flora and fauna in the cracks of the state, in the sort of cracks in the wall, if you like. That's where they can flourish. Okay, my second part, the pull factors of modernity. What are the attractions? What are the aspects of modernity that have helped create new opportunities for violence to flourish? And these are clearly highly diverse. We might group them roughly, I suppose, under sociological and technological headings. By technological, I mean simply the means of destruction, the form of the weapons. Sociological changes I'll deal with first, most briefly, simply by saying the long-term trend is very, very clear here. It is towards a relentless expansion of the universe of deliberately inflicted suffering. What is perhaps historically most remarkable about contemporary political violence are 2 qualities. 1, its social reach. 2, its innate faddishness. What do I mean by each? Well, social reach, until the late 19th century, assassination only really targeted elite figures, royal figures, prime ministers perhaps, because they were the only ones worth targeting. And you can see the diffusion of targeting fairly closely monitor or be in step with the expansion of franchises. As first more and more men got the vote, later women, then parliaments become targets in a way that they hadn't been before. So over certainly 150 years or so, you can see this relentless democratization of violence. Democratization of violence in the sense that anyone can be a target now. Democratization perhaps also in the sense that barriers to entry to actually indulging in violence are also possibly lower. It's easier to get involved. And just as an aside, we tend to forget just how physically accessible, but how socially unreachable leaders of 200 years ago were. When King Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia came to London to celebrate the fall of Napoleon in 1814, he was said to be sulky as a bear because he was kind of constantly hassled and jostled by the crowd. So there was no security, there was no barriers between him and the common people. And if you compare this with, say, that passage in Michelle Obama's memoirs where she first sees the security detail that is now going to accompany her wherever she goes as First Lady of this, 20 heavily armored vehicles that is the minimum kind of security detail, you'll see how far we have traveled. If our leaders have become more impregnable, we, the common people, have become far more vulnerable. We have a political exchange value that our ancestors never had. Our lives are worth cashing in to some as publicity tokens. And I won't, I'll just say on that point, democratic universalism is the hallmark of contemporary terrorist threats. Anyone and everyone might be next. My second point was that, in a historical perspective, what's striking about contemporary violence is its faddishness. What do I mean by that? I mean that contagion effects are very noticeable. The first assassination attempt on the Russian Tsar in the late 19th century was 1878. Within months, there had been 5 across Europe. If you've done any reading around the wider history of terrorism, the sort of hijacking boom of 68 is a similar phenomenon. hijacking had been known before, but there's a point at which it just suddenly becomes contagious. Vehicle attacks, vehicle ramming attacks in 2016 is a kind of similar phenomenon. So these extraordinary moments of something suddenly becoming popular for a short time until either counter-security measures or by some sort of almost invisible consensus, it seems to have run its course and then it dies away again. I mean, just worth pointing out here, although I won't labor it too much, just that somewhere in the background of understanding what has changed in political violence, we have to factor in communication revolutions, not just the communication revolutions of your lifetimes, but older ones as well. In 1789, it took about 10 days for the fall of the Bastille to reach Norfolk in eastern England. In 1963, when President Kennedy was shot, within 5.5 hours, 99.8% of people surveyed had heard the news. And this year, we passed a new low in what you might call the Society of the Spectacle, which was, of course, a live-streamed massacre on Facebook in the Christchurch Mosque. And this relentless acceleration, acceleration of volumes of information and speed of decontextualized information is part of the vital context. Effectively, it creates what you might call a Doppler effect. If you have my half-forgotten physics from school, that the noise of a siren as it comes nearer, it becomes louder, but the note changes. There's something in that relentless acceleration of information that makes political violence that is meant to be communicative. It also changes in its form. Arguably, in some ways, becomes more destabilizing. So that's a little bit on sort of social and communicative background. I just want to talk about, very briefly, on the means of destruction, or rather to focus in a bit more detail on one of them. And that is a very simple observation. Perhaps a banal one to you, but I think worth stressing. Things that go bang tend to dominate the practice of modern political violence. According to the same study I mentioned earlier, the Tweed database of European terrorist events, 55.1% of all the incidents, 1950 to 1995, took the form of explosions, defined here as bombs, car bombs, fire bombs. So bombs are by far the most important weapon in the terrorist arsenal. And I think it's worth asking, where has this come from? I think it's sort of well recognized that the miniaturization, the portability of explosives in the late 19th century is a key turning point. It's more of a puzzle than we often admit, because actually this had been technically possible a long while earlier. We have manuals from 1573 that show basically an IED, an improvised explosive device, of a booby-trapped purse full of shrapnel. You go and pick it up in the street and it explodes. If they could do it in 1573, why did it not become more common? There's a PhD topic to throw out for you. I don't have the answer. But I think it is fair to say that this 1867 moment, the moment at which Alfred Nobel, the Lord of Dynamite, patented Gur dynamite, is rightly recognized as a key moment. I suppose all I would say there is that it's less often stressed that this means that the bombing tradition of political violence is not the stepchild of the 19th century's wars, but the stepchild of its business world. It was the commercial availability of dynamite that made it so powerful. This was a wonder stuff. This was the stuff that drove the St. Gotthard railway line in Switzerland 9 miles through solid granite, that put the Trans-Pacific Railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains, and so on and so forth. It was incredible stuff, and it's on the back of that various criminal and political actors start using it. But from such haphazard and contingent beginnings, it then becomes, really, I think, the way in which rebel groups try to make a statement that gets people's attention. It sort of conveys a political seriousness in a way that other techniques perhaps don't. And if you think about such horrors as the Columbine school massacre of 1998, actually most of the effort went into building bombs that failed to explode. Obviously a borderline case of political violence perhaps, but still interesting to see the effort put in. Barcelona 2017, it was after the bomb factory blew up that the attackers turned to vehicle ramming attacks. Even in the Christchurch mosque massacre, the attacker seems to have had a couple of improvised explosive devices. So there's something about this fetishization of bombs that I think is important. And very often this is, insofar as it's thought of as tool, this kind of turn to bombs is explained as really a matter of capacity. You know, terrorists use bombs because they don't have the capacity to do more ambitious stuff. It's kind of classic hit and run stuff. It's tailored to their modest resources. And there's something in that. But if we want to ask why for 150 years has this remained the dominant form of attack, then perhaps we have to dig deeper, and perhaps we need to look as well at the social psychology of bombing. If you read the memoirs of a New Left activist like Jane Allport, she speaks of the magical secret of possessing dynamite, the sort of excitement in the group that you had this stuff, that you could plan attacks at a time and place of your choosing. And so there's kind of sense of superiority that having explosives can sometimes convey. And I think this comes out, just as an aside, I think it comes out in the extraordinarily consistent use of playful language to denote or to talk about bombs and explosives by violent actors. Think of the very term booby trap, or what the Special Operations Executive in World War II used to call Churchill's toy shop, or the IRA ballads that from the mid-20th century, that the old alarm clock, which is about the 1939 bombing campaign in London. It's kind of all presented as a hilarious practical joke, that we surprised the Brits. So it's this kind of consistently ludic, consistently playful theme. But even here, I'm not quite sure we got to the bottom of why bombs are so attractive. Handguns, after all, are also very destructive, can also be equally concealed and are very portable, yet they don't seem to attract the same treatment. And my best suggestion, tentative as it is that we turn to the work of Randall Collins and his 2008 classic Violence, Micro-Sociological Study. If you don't know the book, I recommend it highly. Collins basically looks mostly at violence in the form of face-to-face confrontations, and he makes the very obvious point, which still we often overlook, that we live in a golden age of violent studies. As long as you've all done your proper ethics procedures and whatever, in theory at least, one can look on YouTube and one can actually see how violence works. And a lot of myths are therefore deconstructed thereby. The classic one is the gunfight at the OK Corral, which I think in most Hollywood treatments lasts about 24 minutes, and yet it's actually been reconstructed fairly accurately and lasted about 83 seconds. In other words, most people involved hit the deck like any sensible person would do if you're being shot at. So we can actually see how violence works in micro detail, and it's often very different to what we expect. Collins concludes, well, good news, bad news. Good news is most human beings, according to Collins, are actually very bad at violence. We are, generally speaking, incompetent technicians of violence. Gender has nothing to do with it. Men are just as crap as women, or vice versa, or gender just doesn't really matter. But generally speaking, we're bad at doing it. That's arguably good news. The bad news caveat is there's a small minority of psychos who are genuinely scary to us all. You remember the kind of kid in the playground who always took the fight a bit further than everyone else. Those are the people that we are genuinely scared of. But the most violence comes out of prior confrontation, emotional tunnels, miscalculations, a misreading of others' intentions. And it is an innately stressful experience that, we tend to hate. Borne out by all those studies that you may be aware of World War II battlefields in the Pacific, where, absolutely tiny percentage of American Marines actually fired their weapon. Or Gettysburg battlefield, where they found muskets that had been loaded 8 times because the guy was just shaking with fear. Couldn't remember he hadn't shot it off. This is how most people are in these situations. So we're not very good at face-to-face violence, is Collins' argument. But there are some subcategories of violence technique that are arguably particularly suited to the anonymous living conditions of contemporary urban cities, the society of strangers, and these techniques are deliberately confrontation avoiding, they're deliberately confrontation minimizing. The professional hitman in the criminal underworld, You know, good contract killers surprise their victims. That's their professionalism. That's their skill. And arguably, bombings fall into the same category. You know, we know from many bombers' memoirs that planting bombs is a stressful experience, but it's arguably a less stressful experience. It is easier to do than entering into the stress of dealing with an alarmed adversary face to face. It's a form of evasive attack. And I don't really want to sort of overstress this point. I think you can take it too far, but I think there is something there in the attraction of bombs as intrinsically lowering entry costs for people to get involved in political violence who might not otherwise do so. Again, if we look at the New Left groups of the early 70s, and I only keep referring to them because they've actually been relatively prolific in their memoirs, but you know, there's some very complex intersectionalities of background. People like Mark Rudd, who was one of the kind of leading activists in the early days of the Weather Underground, and there's a description where he gets punched on stage and he's in total shock. He's a middle-class kid who's never fought anyone in his life. He's preached a good war against the American state, but when someone actually takes a dig at him, he's amazed. Again, Jane Orpert, a publisher by profession at the time she gets involved, middle class, Kathy Wilkerson as well, and particularly the middle class female activists. It's hard to see them getting involved perhaps in other forms of violence. They say they didn't like street fighting. Jane Orpert isn't very happy about her boyfriend running around with a gun, but somehow these become actually very proficient bomb planters. Kathy Wilkinson's case perhaps takes it a bit further. I'll be careful what I say, I'm being recorded. But the point being that it's hard to see these individuals getting involved in other types of violence, but somehow planting bombs is an evasive type of violence that, you know, somehow smooths the path to that. So we might really see bombing not as a weapon of the weak as such, so much as a weapon of the meek. It's a sort of evasive form of confrontation, suited to those not well suited to other forms of violence. Now, I could say more about the technologies of destruction. I'm conscious that I've traded upon your patience quite long enough, so I feel I should move towards some sort of conclusion in drawing together remarks on the present moment we're in. And, you know, as perhaps befits the director of a research centre looking both back and forward, that conclusion is pretty open-ended. Taking long-term views in some ways is strangely comforting, actually. Any survey of the evolution of political violence in the past 250 years, I think, has to stress deeper roots of stability in Western societies. Control of public violence, at least, is one of the great domestic success stories. Now, admittedly, as I say, this has been achieved through a relentless exercise of infrastructural power and over greater and greater areas of public life. But it is this, more than anything else, that has sort of squeezed violence, insurrectionist violence, out of modern politics largely. Historians should never do prediction. You know, historians, when they don't want to get drawn into something, say, oh, that's not my period. Well, the future is definitely not my period. I'm a historian. And I also hesitate to make firm predictions in the light of recent news, delayed Brexits, attempts to impeach Donald Trump, last night's scenes from the House of Commons, and so on and so forth. Still, I'll hazard a guess that the age of coups, civil wars, revolutions in the classic sense is over in the societies that I have been looking at. Those phenomena seem to belong very much to the past. Basic state stability endures despite the challenges of management of public order that the internet society throws up. And, you know, I think just to say a word on the information revolutions that you have, most of you, grown up with and that are your reality. I mean, I think a few years ago, social scientists got a little bit overexcited about globalization and information revolutions. Sort of authors like Zygmunt Bauman, Susan Strange tended to sort of hasten to proclaim the death of the nation state as a sort of key locus or arena of power politics. You know, rise of transnational terror networks that could pull off repeated 9/11s seemed like a distinctive possibility for a while. And that 2 centuries long process of accretion of state power that I have tried to explore tonight seemed in the late 20th, early 21st century to come to a halt and perhaps to be thrown abruptly into reverse. A new age of chaos seemed to beckon. Well, you know, I do think that the current moment is a little more open-ended than that. And events in Chemnitz in Saxony last August, if any of you followed them, I don't know, but I think they sort of showed some of this in action. So at the end of August, 26th of August 2018, early hours of the morning, a 35-year-old German-Cuban carpenter was stabbed to death by, apparently by two asylum seekers of Arab background. Within hours, there were 800 demonstrators on the march. By the evening of the same day, 26th of August, there were 6,000 neo-Nazis demonstrating and indeed roughing up people, chasing them who they didn't like the look of. 591 police, massively outnumbered, clearly under-resourced, struggled to keep the 6,000 Nazis away from a smaller counter-demonstration of 1,500 or so people. Very shortly after, leaked documentation by camera phone emerged from within the German Interior Ministry, showing that one of the suspects should have already been deported from the country. And eventually, Hans-Georg Maaßen, the head of the German intelligence services, was forced to resign. So the hallmark of this gathering crisis was that the official authorities, the constituted authorities, were constantly on the back foot. They were constantly outpaced by social media, other forms of mobilization, football hooligan networks, and so on and so forth. And they struggled, obviously, to control the crisis and arguably, lost control for a while. So it seems the Chemnitz events of last summer seem like it's sort of summer before last, seem like a classic case of the erosion of state authority and public law and order in the face of destabilizing surges of information turbulence. But there's a sequel that has been rather less noticed, which is that when local elements of that far-right scene tried to move to organize themselves as a group called Revolution Chemnitz, move towards a bombing strategy, try and provoke a civil war conditions in Germany against left-wingers and asylum seekers and so on and so forth, within a matter of days, the German security services had rolled them up, had shut them down. Let's not forget that daily living spews out electronic evidence trails in all directions. I'm one of those obstinate people who goes into supermarkets and they keep offering me loyalty cards and I keep saying no, so why won't you take one? It's my pathetic little protest at trying not to be monitored all the time. But for better or worse, the surveillance opportunities of the state and indeed commercial society are massively enhanced by the information revolution. The underground movements of the 70s and 80s would be very hard to replicate today. So yes, that is part of it, it has become harder for public order to be managed, but there are counter-trends as well. Public moods are certainly more febrile, I think. They're more alarmist. We live in a sort of very alarmist age, and it does seem to me that one of the big differences between my childhood and many of the students I teach is in that macro Cold War context of how we think about violence. Tonight is a very obscure but arguably a very significant anniversary. 36 years ago exactly to the day, 26th of September 1983, in the depths of the Cold War, when relations between the Soviet Union and America were particularly tense, a Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov looked at his screen, and his job was to monitor the American satellites, or to monitor the satellite information, because just in case the USA launched a preemptive nuclear strike, and the screen went red, the alarm sounded, 5 nuclear missiles were apparently coming his way. As he put it in his memoirs, I felt I was sitting on a frying pan. He knew that there would be about 20 minutes before they might hit, and that every second he didn't report it up the chain meant less time for his superiors to react. He took the hunch it might be a computer error. He was right. We're all still here. He got into trouble for falsifying his logbook. That tells you something about how bureaucracies work. But arguably, he did us all an enormous service. Let's not kid ourselves that this town and this university would still be standing in the event of an all-out nuclear exchange. This was a Cold War front line with RAF Lucas and the not-so-secret bunker down the road. I mean, how did the Soviets not know about something that you spent months excavating and then putting a little farmhouse on top? This would all be radioactive ruins. And I think that does make an enormous difference. When IRA bombs went off in London and Birmingham in the 70s and 80s, horrific as it was in my childhood, somewhere in the background, amongst more thoughtful people at least, was some awareness worse things could happen. And to some extent, we have, I think, rather lost sight of that. This is a good time for amateur propagandists of mayhem, self-appointed saviors and rabble-rousers, to ride these decontextualized information surges and flows in reckless ways. But that does not follow from that governments are about to collapse. States in many ways, as I say, have also been strengthened by the information revolution. Okay, so that, in a sense, is my good news. I don't think the political violence we see around us is any kind of existential threat, at least to the societies of the global north I've particularly focused on. And my last heresy for you this evening on that point, as Director of Major Terrorism Studies Research Centre, is to say, don't worry about terrorism, worry about the melting ice caps, it's far more important. Greta Thunberg is right. So there you have it. I've committed how many heresies is that now? Don't worry about defining terrorism. There are worse things out there, and so on and so forth. But I don't think it's right to end there either. This retrospective survey of the past 250 years also offers us no shortage of less comforting lessons as well. Before the revolutions of the late 18th century, in America and France, violent threats to political elites were both highly limited and highly sporadic. They remained focused at the very top of society because these were very unequal societies. That is where power was located. By the early 21st century, by contrast, the general aura of threat has become firmly institutionalized along impeccably democratic and apparently permanent lines. If much of the violence that we see in the news remains fairly amateur and improvised, there certainly seems to be a lot more of it. Security services do seem to struggle with a sheer atomization of mobilization. So endless waves of self-starters, stray dogs, lone wolves, whatever you want to call them. The sort of dark side of individualistic society gone rampant. And moreover, a lot of this violence seems harder to ignore. It seems to create more of a splash. Within what I think of as the giant magic lantern show of social media, such horrors are relentlessly magnified, and the shadows grow larger and longer. And seen from this vantage point, the dark progress of modern political violence is one of relentless diffusion. From individual assassination to general massacre, from hazard of social rank to rank social hazard, from the classes to the masses, from feud to fad, an ever-widening Gaia. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.